The alarm on Daniel Marsh's phone went off at 5:15 in the morning on Thursday, September 4th, 2014. The same time it had gone off every day for the past 11 years, whether he had somewhere to be or not. His daughter, Abby, would tell investigators later that her father was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 5:30. She said it like it was an endearing flaw, the kind of harmless eccentricity that only becomes painful in retrospect. Once the person is gone and you find yourself remembering the small, unguarded things with a sharpness that the larger memories can't compete with. Daniel was 51 years old. He had a face that looked like the landscape he loved, weathered, deeply lined, honest. He wore his silver brown hair short and favored flannel shirts even in summer, always with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had worked for 23 years as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Bozeman, Montana, and he was good at it. Methodical, patient, the kind of man who checked his load calculations twice and his equipment lists 3 times. His colleagues at Morrison and Hale Associates described him as the most reliable man in the office. His ex-wife, Carol Marsh, who had remained on warm terms with him after their 2009 divorce, described him as the most reliable man she'd ever known in any context whatsoever, and said it without bitterness, as a simple statement of empirical fact. Daniel had been planning this trip since February. He had a legal pad on his kitchen table at the house on Bridger Drive, a modest 2-story with a vegetable garden in the back, and on that legal pad he had written in his precise architect's block lettering every item of equipment he intended to carry, every mile of trail he intended to cover, every campsite he intended to use. The trip was to last 9 days. It would take him deep into the Shoshone National Forest, eastward along the North Fork of the Shoshone River, and into the high terrain south of Yellowstone's boundary, country that received perhaps 1,000 visitors a year compared to the 3 million who passed through Yellowstone's geyser basins and gift shops. He had done this route twice before, in 2009 and 2012. He knew the country. That was the phrase his daughter would use over and over again, in every conversation with every ranger and investigator who spoke to her in the weeks and months that followed. He knew the country. She said it the way people say things they believe ought to matter, the way people cling to competence as though it were a form of protection. At 6:20 that Thursday morning, Daniel ate breakfast at the kitchen table. His daughter Abby, who was 26 and had driven up from Billings the previous evening to see him off, sat across from him with coffee. He had scrambled eggs and toast. He read 3 pages of the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. He refilled his coffee once. These details would be reconstructed later from Abby's memory, and her memory of them was exquisite in the way that last mornings often are, photographically precise, as though some part of the brain had already known to start recording. At 7:05 a.m., Daniel's truck, a 2009 Ford F250 in dark green, Montana plate 482714J, backed out of the driveway at 1847 Bridger Drive. Abby stood on the front porch in her socks. He rolled down the window and said without particular ceremony, "I'll call you when I get back to Signal. Should be the 14th. She said, "I know, Dad. You've told me 4 times. He laughed. He drove away. The drive from Bozeman to the Wapiti trailhead off Highway 20, just past the small community of Wapiti, Wyoming, took approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes with no traffic. By Daniel's habitual standards, he would have stopped once for gas and once to check his pack. There was a surveillance camera at the Exxon station in Livingston. Daniel almost certainly passed it, though that footage would not be reviewed until weeks later, after it had already been overwritten. At 10:17 a.m., Daniel's truck was observed by a National Forest Service employee, a seasonal trail crew worker named Garrett Olson, 22 years old, on his 2nd year with the crew, pulling into the Elk Fork campground parking area, which served as the nearest trailhead access point for the route Daniel had planned. Olson was clearing debris from a drainage culvert about 40 feet from the parking lot. He noticed the green truck because it was the only vehicle there, and because the man who got out of it was so methodical about his preparations that Olson, by his own later account, found himself watching without intending to. Daniel spent approximately 25 minutes in the parking lot. He made 2 phone calls, one to Abby, confirmed later by cell records, at 10:23 a.m., lasting 1 minute and 44 seconds, and one to a friend and former colleague named Brett Selway at 10:31 a.m., lasting 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The content of the call with Selway would be summarized by Selway for investigators. Daniel confirmed his planned route, confirmed his expected return date of September 14th, confirmed that he had left a copy of his trip plan with Abby and a second copy with the Shoshone National Forest Ranger District Office in Cody. He said by Selway's account that the weather forecast looked clean for the first 6 days and that he wasn't concerned about the possibility of early season weather after that. He said he was looking forward to it. At 10:44 a.m., Garrett Olson observed Daniel hoist his pack, a large Osprey Atmos in slate gray, approximately 65 liters, visibly heavy but fitted close to Daniel's frame, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had loaded and adjusted that same pack many times, and walk east on the trail. Olson noted that Daniel moved well for a man of his age. He noted that Daniel paused once, about 30 meters up the trail, and looked back toward his truck the way people sometimes do, not out of doubt, but out of something harder to name. Then he turned and walked into the trees and was gone from sight. The morning was cool, 53 degrees Fahrenheit at the trailhead elevation of 6,200 feet, with a sky that local meteorological records for that date describe as partly cloudy, with a high thin overcast and winds from the southwest at between 8 and 12 miles per hour. The aspens along the Elk Fork drainage had not yet begun to turn. Their leaves were still a deep, late summer green, dense and slightly dusty looking in the flat light. The sound of the creek was constant. It was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Marsh. His truck remained in the Elk Fork parking lot. Over the following days, 2 other parties, a couple from Denver who completed a 3-day loop, and a solo photographer from Missoula doing a documentary project on high country meadows, parked near it and returned and drove away without giving it particular thought. A vehicle in a trailhead parking lot was not unusual. It was, in fact, the expected thing. On the evening of September 14th, a Sunday, Abby Marsh sat in her apartment in Billings and waited for her phone to ring. She had dinner, she watched television, she checked her phone at 8 p.m. and again at 9. At 10:15 p.m., she called her father's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She told herself that the signal at the trailhead could be inconsistent. She had been telling herself this since 9 o'clock. She called again at 11 o'clock. Again, voicemail. She did not sleep that night. At 7 a.m. on Monday, September 15th, she called the Shoshone National Forest District Office in Cody and told them her father had not checked in. The woman who took the call was a dispatcher named Linda Howarth, a 15-year veteran of the Forest Service, and she pulled Daniel's trip plan from the file, where it had been sitting since early August, and began making notes. By 8:30 a.m., she had reached the 2-person search and rescue coordinating team at the Shoshone. By 9:15, with the truck confirmed still in the parking lot via a ranger field check, the assessment changed from overdue to missing. The search began the following morning. The Shoshone National Forest, the oldest national forest in the United States, covers approximately 2.4 million acres of terrain that ranges from sage-covered valley floors to granite peaks above 13,000 feet. In the country east and south of Yellowstone's boundary, where Daniel Marsh had planned his route, the terrain is an amalgam of dense conifer forest, open elk meadows, creek drainages choked with willows and deadfall, and high rocky ridgelines from which the views extend so far in every direction that distance itself becomes a kind of vertigo. It is country where a man can disappear without any dark intention behind the disappearance, where a simple misstep on loose shale, a creek crossing gone wrong, a single wrong decision in a sudden afternoon storm can produce outcomes that no amount of experience or preparation can offset. The search and rescue teams who work this territory know this. They have practiced holding both possibilities simultaneously, the accident and the other thing, whatever the other thing might be. The initial search operation was formally activated at 7 a.m. on Tuesday, September 16th. Lead coordinator was Supervisory Ranger Thomas Eldridge, 44, a lean man with pale blue eyes and 30 years of backcountry experience in Wyoming and Montana. His team for the first operational period consisted of 8 ground searchers, 2 of them with trained search dogs, a Belgian Malinois named Castor, handled by a woman named Diane Morell, and a bloodhound named Porter, handled by a former sheriff's deputy named Wayne Trujillo, 61, who had been volunteering his animal for searches since 2007. There was also a contracted helicopter from a company out of Cody, a Bell 206 Jet Ranger with an experienced mountain pilot, a man named Colin Frey, who had flown search operations for 14 years. The initial strategy was straightforward. Daniel's trip plan was specific and detailed, one of the most useful trip plans Eldridge had seen in years of coordinating searches. It listed intended campsites by GPS coordinate, gave estimated daily mileages, noted water sources, and alternative routes in the event of trail conditions. Eldridge later said, in the formal debrief transcript, that a plan that thorough was both reassuring and slightly unusual. Most people give you a general area and a vague timeline, he said. He gave us a topographic outline with margin notes. The search prioritized the first campsite on Daniel's plan, a flat area along a tributary of the South Fork of the Shoshone near a landmark the local guides called the Double Spruce Camp, at an elevation of 7,800 feet, approximately 8.4 miles from the Elk Fork trailhead. The helicopter reached it in 11 minutes of flight time. Ground teams took 4 hours. The campsite was empty. The fire ring was cold and contained no ash from a recent fire. The ground showed no tent stakes, no cleared sleeping area, no food hang wire. Castor, the Belgian Malinois, worked the perimeter in a systematic grid pattern and indicated twice, once at the northern edge of the flat, near a stand of Engelmann spruce, and once at a spot 40 meters west, where the ground was soft near the creek bank. Both indications were of human scent. Neither produced a trail that could be sustained. The ground was dry. The week since Daniel's entry had been warm and windy. The search expanded. Over the following 4 days, ground teams worked outward from each of Daniel's 7 planned campsites. The helicopter flew every accessible ridgeline and drainage in a radius of 12 miles from the trailhead. The pilot, Frey, logged 6 hours of flight time per day. He later said that from the air, in country that dense and that vast, a man or a body was approximately as visible as a stone. That is essentially invisible, unless you happen to be looking at exactly the right piece of ground, at the right altitude, at the right moment. He said this without defeatism, simply as a technical fact. The weather held through the first 5 days. On day 6, Sunday, September the 21st, a cold front pushed down from Canada overnight and dropped 6 inches of snow at elevations above 9,000 feet by morning. The helicopter was grounded until noon. The ground teams, already pushing into territory where fatigue and altitude were compounding factors, pressed on in conditions that Eldridge's incident log describes as significantly impeded visibility, deteriorating trail conditions, and wind gusts interfering with dog work. It was on the afternoon of that snowy Sunday, at approximately 2:40 p.m., that ground searcher Marcus Webb, a 29-year-old volunteer from Cody, a rock climber and backcountry skier who had participated in 6 previous search operations, found the first and only physical evidence of Daniel Marsh's passage. It was a candy wrapper, specifically a Cliff Bar wrapper, the original flavor, with a thin coating of frost on its exterior and a slight degree of decomposition at one torn edge, consistent with approximately 2 weeks of outdoor exposure. It was partially caught beneath a small boulder at the edge of a creek, crossing approximately 11.3 miles from the trailhead, 2.9 miles beyond Daniel's first planned campsite, and roughly consistent with his planned route toward the second campsite. Webb photographed it in place, flagged it, and radioed Eldridge. The wrapper was bagged and logged as evidence item SAR-0916-01. Lab analysis later confirmed the presence of saliva residue on the inner foil, and DNA extracted from that residue matched Daniel Marsh's DNA profile, obtained from a toothbrush provided by Abby. He had been there. He had eaten a Cliff Bar at or near that creek crossing. He had gone on. But where he had gone from that creek crossing was a question the landscape refused to answer. The creek itself, running fast and cold, perhaps 20 feet wide at that crossing, over smooth, rounded boulders, showed no footprints, no fabric catches, no equipment debris. The forest on the far bank was unbroken. By Friday, September the 26th, day 10 of the search, Thomas Eldridge sat in the incident command post, which occupied the back room of a ranger station cabin near Wapiti, and reviewed his resource inventory. 64 person-days of ground search, approximately 47 hours of aerial coverage, 7 separate dog team deployments. He had a candy wrapper and 2 scent indications in a 2.4 million acre forest. The decision to reclassify the operation from active rescue to investigative recovery, the bureaucratic language for the suspension of active search, was made on the morning of Saturday, September the 27th. Eldridge announced it at the 7 a.m. briefing. The room was very quiet. Diane Morell, the dog handler, was present at that briefing, and a journalist who later reported on the case noted that Morell kept her hand on Castor's collar for the entire duration of Eldridge's announcement, the dog sitting perfectly still beside her as though he understood. The official incident closure report, filed with the Shoshone National Forest on October 3, 2014, listed Daniel Marsh's status as missing, whereabouts unknown. Case open for further information. Abby Marsh, back in Billings, read those words on a printout she had requested and held the paper for a long time before she put it down. Time moves differently around an unresolved disappearance. It doesn't stop. That would be a simpler thing, a grief that had a shape and a boundary. Instead, it continues, carrying everything forward: bills, seasons, birthdays, the ordinary mechanics of living. While beneath the surface current, there is a fixed point that does not move, a door that remains open. A question that generates no answer but never stops generating itself. Abby Marsh was 26 in September 2014. She was 27 in 2015, 28 in 2016. She kept her phone charged and close. She kept her father's trip plan in a manila folder in the drawer of her desk at the engineering firm in Billings where she worked. She had followed her father into structural engineering, which had always seemed to Daniel like one of the finest things that had ever happened to him. She read the trip plan sometimes, not because it told her anything new, but because it was the last document his hands had made. The block lettering, the Jeep's coordinates, the margin notes about water sources and weather windows. Carol Marsh, Daniel's ex-wife, had remarried in 2013, the year before the disappearance, to a man named Philip Hoult, who taught high school biology in Missoula. She had been close to Daniel even after the divorce. They had remained friends in the way that people who spent a quarter century together and parted without violence sometimes can. And the disappearance settled into her life like a weight she carried at a slight but constant angle. She told a reporter from the Billings Gazette, in a piece published in 2016 on the second anniversary, that she still set a place at the table for Daniel at Thanksgiving. Not literally, but in her mind. She said she wasn't sure when that would stop. Brett Selway, Daniel's friend who had received the last confirmed phone call, spent 2 weekends in October 2014 driving the approach roads to the Shoshone with a pair of binoculars and his own backcountry experience, covering ground that the formal search had not prioritized. He found nothing. He returned the following spring, in May 2015, when the snow had melted enough to make the high terrain accessible. Again, nothing. He filed informal reports with the Ranger District after each visit, noting the terrain he had covered, the conditions he had observed. Thomas Eldridge, who remained the case contact for the district, received those reports and acknowledged them with brief, professional replies. The case attracted intermittent media attention in the years following. A short segment on a regional news program in 2015, a longer piece in a hiking and outdoor publication in 2016, which ran alongside a photograph of Daniel from a 2011 trip to the Wind Rivers. His face turned 3/4 from the camera, looking at something in the middle distance, squinting slightly in the high-altitude sun. A thread on a backcountry hiking forum that generated considerable speculation and then went quiet, as such threads do. A true crime podcast out of Portland that contacted Abby in 2017 and proposed to dedicate an episode to the case. She agreed, then reconsidered, then agreed again. The episode aired in March 2017. It received 140,000 downloads in its first week, which was respectable for the program at that time. It generated several hundred listener tips to the Shoshone National Forest Ranger District, almost all of which described unrelated incidents or expressed general sympathy, and none of which produced actionable information. The case file at the Shoshone District Office grew. Tips were documented and assessed. Reports filed, physical evidence, the Cliff Bar wrapper, the scent indication logs, photographs of the campsite areas searched. The Jeep's track of the helicopter coverage remained in evidence storage in a box labeled Marsh, Daniel C. Missing Person, September 4, 2014. In the summer of 2018, a retired Wyoming game warden named Curtis Abe, 67 years old, a man of very few words and encyclopedic knowledge of the country between the Shoshone and Yellowstone's eastern boundary, began making a series of solo excursions into the terrain east of the Thoroughfare Corridor, a remote region that the formal search had touched only at its edges. He did this because he had read the podcast episode's transcript, which a friend had emailed to him, and something in the description of where the Cliff Bar wrapper had been found did not sit right with him. The wrapper had been found 2.9 miles beyond the first campsite, consistent with the planned route toward the second campsite. But the second campsite was northeast, and the creek crossing where the wrapper was found was at a junction, a point where a faint, unofficial path, not marked on any current trail map, branched southwest into country that the formal search had not covered in depth. Abe did not share his theory immediately. He was by habit a man who verified before he spoke. He made 3 excursions that summer and fall, covering ground methodically, camping out of a base camp he established on a plateau above the creek junction. On his 3rd excursion in late October 2018, he found something. He photographed it. He drove to Cody and requested a meeting with the ranger district. What he had found was described in his written statement, filed with the district on November 2, 2018, as follows. A campsite, clearly not new, situated in a heavily screened draw approximately 1.7 miles southwest of the creek junction where the evidence wrapper was located. The site was not Daniel Marsh's camp. The equipment was not consistent with a recreational hiker. There was a hand-dug latrine. There were multiple cache points containing food and supplies, some weathered and some recent. There was evidence of occupation spanning multiple seasons. I am not a law enforcement officer, and I make no legal conclusions, but this site should be examined by people with the proper authority. Thomas Eldridge, now 52, and with a slight but permanent forward lean that years of backcountry hiking had built into his posture, read that statement at his desk on the afternoon of November 5th, 2018. He read it twice. Then he picked up the phone. The years of silence were about to end. Not with a revelation, not yet, but with a question so precise and so cold that it was almost worse than silence. Whose camp was this, and what did it know? The call came at 6:48 in the morning on Thursday, May 14th, 2020. The caller was a woman named Rosa Delgado, 43, a seasonal employee of the Shoshone National Forest, working on a backcountry trail assessment crew. She had been in the field since the previous Monday, working an access inventory in the drainage country southwest of Eagle Peak. She was using a satellite communicator, a Garmin InReach device, because this was standard protocol for her crew, and because cell service in that country was non-existent. When she reached the Ranger District dispatcher at 6:48 a.m. on that Thursday, she had been sitting on a boulder at the edge of a meadow for approximately 40 minutes, waiting for what she had found to stop feeling like something she might have imagined. She had not imagined it. The dispatcher on duty that morning was a young man named Chris Farwell, 24, on his first full year with the district. He would later say, in an interview conducted as part of the case file, that the quality of Rosa Delgado's voice, when she spoke, was something he had never encountered before in a dispatch call. Not hysterical, not incoherent, but stripped of all unnecessary inflection, the way voices sometimes get when the mind has decided that the only safe channel is factual, sequential, unemotional. She sounded, Farwell said, like she was reading from a report she was writing in her head as she spoke. What Rosa Delgado reported in the formal incident intake summary was as follows. At approximately 6:05 a.m. on May 14, 2020, during an early morning survey of a meadow near the head of a southwest draining tributary, her Jeep's coordinates placed her at 44 degrees 8 minutes 31 seconds north, 109 degrees 44 minutes 17 seconds west. At an elevation of approximately 8,400 feet, she had observed a figure sitting at the edge of the tree line, approximately 60 meters distant. She had initially assumed it was another Forest Service employee or a backcountry hiker. She had called out. The figure had not responded. She had approached. As she closed the distance to approximately 20 meters, she realized the figure was a man. He was seated with his back against the trunk of a large Engelmann spruce, his legs extended in front of him. He was wearing what appeared to be remnants of clothing, a flannel shirt, heavily deteriorated and repaired multiple times with what looked like strips of bark fiber and duct tape. He was thin. Rosa would use the word skeletal in her statement, and then correct it to emaciated, and then return to skeletal because she said it was more accurate. His hair and beard were long and entirely silver white. His face was turned toward the open meadow, but his eyes were not tracking the way a person's eyes track when they are looking at something. They were looking through. She said his name. She did not yet know his name, and asked if he was all right. He turned his head toward her slowly, with the deliberate care of someone managing severe pain or exhaustion. And when his eyes met hers, he said something she could not immediately understand. She moved closer. She crouched down. She asked him again if he was all right. What he said, repeated twice before she understood it, was, "Is it May?" She said yes. He closed his eyes. He said, "Then it's been a long time." Rosa Delgado had a basic first aid kit, 2 liters of water, 2 days of food, and a satellite communicator. She used all of them. She wrapped the man in the emergency bivvy from her kit, gave him water in very small amounts. She was careful about this. She knew enough about dehydration and refeeding to know that giving too much too fast was dangerous, and sat beside him and talked to him in a low, even voice, while she waited for dispatch to confirm the coordinates and initiate the rescue response. At 8:30 a.m., a helicopter from Cody, not the same machine as in 2014, but the same company with a different pilot, landed in the meadow. 2 paramedics rappelled a short distance to the tree line where the man was sitting. One of them, a woman named Janet Cruz, 37, would describe the scene in the medical response report in language that was entirely clinical and entirely insufficient. Patient, male, estimated age 55 to 65, severely malnourished, dehydrated, hypothermic, multiple healed and partially healed wounds on hands, forearms, and lower extremities. Evidence of frostbite damage to both small toes on left foot and 2 toes on right. Mental status alert and oriented to person and partially to time and place. It was Thomas Eldridge, now 58, who made the identification. He was at the Cody Medical Center when the helicopter landed. He had driven from his home to the hospital in 42 minutes after receiving the dispatch call. He stood in the corridor outside the trauma bay and waited, and when the paramedics wheeled the gurney past him, the man still wrapped in the orange emergency bivvy, an oxygen mask over his face, an IV already running in his left arm, Eldridge looked at the face and looked at the 6-year-old missing person photograph pinned to the inside of the case folder he had been carrying since 2014. The silver-white hair, the deep-set eyes, the specific architecture of the cheekbones and brow. He said the name quietly, as though it were a question. The man on the gurney turned his head a fraction. His eyes found Eldridge's face. Something in them shifted, a complex layered motion, like ice moving, and he gave a single, very small nod. It was Daniel Marsh. He was 57 years old. He had been missing for 5 years, 8 months, and 10 days. Abby Marsh received the call at 9:22 a.m. She was at her desk at work. She answered on the second ring. She said almost nothing during the call, which lasted 4 minutes and 16 seconds. When it ended, she sat for a moment, and then she stood up and walked to her office doorway and said to her colleague in the adjacent workspace, in a voice that the colleague would later describe as impossibly calm, "They found my father. He's alive. I need to go." She was in Cody by 2 in the afternoon. At the hospital, before the detailed interviews began, before the search teams went back in with everything they now knew, Daniel spoke only briefly and with great effort. He was severely malnourished. His weight had fallen to approximately 128 pounds from a starting weight, documented by his doctor in a 2013 checkup, of 182 pounds. His blood work showed markers consistent with long-term malnutrition and intermittent starvation cycles. His hands showed multiple healed lacerations and what the attending physician, Dr. Aaron Belk, described as evidence of prolonged repetitive manual labor without adequate protective equipment. What Daniel told Eldridge in those first brief minutes, before the physicians intervened and insisted on rest, was exactly 6 sentences long. The investigative summary rendered them as follows. I went off trail at the creek junction. There was a man. He had a camp. He kept me there. I don't know how long at first. I lost track. I got away 6 days ago. He would say more later, much more. But those 6 sentences were enough for Thomas Eldridge to understand, with a cold and absolute clarity, why the search had found nothing in 2014. They had been looking for a missing person. They should have been looking for a hidden one. That afternoon, Eldridge convened a briefing with the Park County Sheriff's Department, the FBI field office in Salt Lake City, whose jurisdiction covered federal land crimes in Wyoming, and a lead detective from the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation named Paula Veitch, 49, who had spent 14 years working violent crime cases and who drove 4 hours from Cheyenne to Cody that same evening, arriving at 7:15 p.m. with a laptop and a legal pad and a thermos of coffee and the specific, focused energy of a person who has spent a long time waiting for a case like this to arrive. She sat in the hospital conference room and listened to Thomas Eldridge's summary for 22 minutes without interrupting. When he finished, she uncapped her pen and said, "Where's the camp?" The approach to the camp took 6 hours on foot from the nearest trailhead. Paula Veitch made that approach on Saturday, May 16, 2020, at the head of a team that included 4 FBI special agents, 3 Wyoming DCI investigators, 2 Shoshone National Forest law enforcement rangers, and a forensic documentation specialist named Gary Oates, 52, a meticulous and almost spectacularly quiet man who had documented crime scenes for 24 years and who carried his equipment in a custom-built hard-shell case that he had never, in 2 decades of fieldwork, allowed anyone else to carry. Thomas Eldridge led the approach. He had, in the preceding 48 hours, obtained from Daniel Marsh, in painstaking interview sessions at the hospital, each lasting no more than 30 minutes before Daniel's physicians imposed rest intervals, a description of the camp's location that Eldridge had correlated with the terrain notes from Curtis Abe's 2018 report. The camp was not the same one Abe had found. Abe had found what would later be determined to be a cache site, a forward supply position. The camp itself was deeper in, 1.4 miles southwest of Abe's discovery, in a draw so thoroughly screened by topography and dense conifer growth that it was invisible from any adjacent ridgeline or meadow. The helicopter coverage in 2014, which had been extensive, had flown directly over that country. It had seen nothing. They smelled it before they saw it. The smell reached the team at approximately 11:40 a.m. as they descended into the draw from the east. It was Gary Oates who first noted it. He had that kind of disciplined sensory attentiveness that years of forensic work build into a person. And he stopped on the trail and raised a closed fist in the silent gesture that signals the team to stop. Everyone stopped. The smell was complex: wood smoke, old and cold, animal fat, the specific sour, sharp smell of composting organic waste, and beneath all of it, something biological and intimate that the team members would each describe slightly differently in their post-operation reports, but that they all recognized as the smell of long-term human habitation of an enclosed space, a smell that is fundamentally different from the smell of backcountry camping, which is relatively clean and transient. This smell had depth. It had years in it. The camp materialized out of the trees as the team moved down the draw. It was not what any of them had expected. That was the first thing every team member mentioned in their separate debriefs. Not the magnitude of what was there, but the surprise of its organization. It was not a simple hide, not the kind of rough bivouac that a wilderness drifter assembles from tarps and expedients. It was a compound, small but deliberate, engineered. The central structure was a cabin. The word cabin is used in the official documentation, though shelter might be more accurate, constructed from timber harvested on site, with walls approximately 7 feet high, a roof of layered spruce boughs over a ridgepole structure, with a secondary waterproofing layer made from a patchwork of plastic sheeting that bore the logo of a commercial landscaping supply company. The door was a salvaged aluminum interior door, interior grade, not designed for outdoor use, visibly warped from moisture cycling, but hinged and latched with functional hardware. There were 2 windows, each roughly 12 inches by 18 inches, covered from the inside with plywood. The exterior dimensions of the cabin were approximately 14 feet by 22 feet. Veitch directed the team to hold the perimeter, while she, Eldridge, and one FBI agent, Special Agent Ramon Torres, 38, who had worked kidnapping and unlawful restraint cases for 8 years and who had a very precise and careful manner in the field that other agents described as almost surgical, approached the door. Torres knocked once. No response. He called out, "Federal law enforcement, Shoshone National Forest. Is anyone inside?" Silence. He looked at Veitch. She gave a single, small nod. The door swung inward with a sound that no one who was present would later forget. A long, low wooden protest, like something that had been closed for a very long time and did not want to open. From the dark space beyond came air that hit them in a wall, warm, stagnant, the composite smell of wood smoke and food residue and unwashed textiles, and, under it all, the particular closed-in quality of a space that had been someone's entire world. Torres went in first with a flashlight. The overhead light fixture, a battery-powered LED lantern mounted on the ridgepole, responded when he found the switch mounted beside the door. It illuminated the interior in a flat, cold white. The cabin was divided roughly in two by a partition wall made of stacked cordwood that reached approximately 2/3 of the cabin's height. Not a full dividing wall, more a separation of space. The front section, approximately 8 feet deep, functioned as a combined kitchen and work area. There was a cast-iron camp stove, heavily used, with a properly constructed flue that exited through the south wall and was camouflaged at the exterior with a heat dispersal baffle, a deliberate modification to reduce the thermal signature visible from the air. There were shelves made from split logs on wooden brackets, stocked with canned goods and dried food in sealed containers, labeled in a neat, small handwriting. There was a work table made from a plank across 2 stump sections on which tools were laid in a precise row: a folding saw, a hand plane, a draw knife, a set of awls, a sewing kit assembled in a tobacco tin. The back section, reached through a gap in the cordwood partition, was approximately 14 feet deep. This was the living area. There were 2 sleeping areas. One was clearly the owner's, a raised platform bed with a proper sleeping bag and a pillow, flanked by a small shelf with personal items. The other was not. The second sleeping area was on the floor. It was a wooden platform approximately 2 feet off the ground, 6 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, with edges that were worn smooth at specific points. Attached to the base of the platform, at the head end right corner, was a steel ring, lag-bolted through the platform base and anchored into a concrete pad, hand-poured, precisely centered under the ring, that had been set directly into the earth beneath the cabin floor. The concrete was old. Its surface was smooth at the edges from contact. From the ring hung a length of chain, the size and gauge used for livestock, the kind available at any rural hardware or feed supply store. The chain was approximately 4 feet long. At its free end was a steel cuff, commercially manufactured, with a key lock. The cuff was open. It had been open, based on Daniel Marsh's account, for 6 days. Gary Oates documented the ring and chain with 47 photographs from 6 angles before touching anything. He noted in his field log that the concrete pad showed significant wear at its surface, consistent with years of pressure from above, from a person's weight resting on it repeatedly over a long period of time. He noted that the platform's edges bore deep scratches in a pattern consistent with long-term manual abrasion. He photographed the scratches. They would later be used to produce an estimate, based on wood density and scratch depth, of the minimum time a person had been confined in that space. The estimate, produced by a forensic materials specialist at the University of Wyoming, would be no less than 3 years. On the shelf beside the owner's bed, Veitch and Torres found the personal effects of the cabin's builder and occupant, a leather journal filled with entries in the same small, neat handwriting as the food container labels, a collection of maps, USGS topographic sheets, hand-annotated over years, with trails, water sources, seasonal changes, animal routes, a worn copy of Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac, its spine broken and repaired with electrical tape, a set of photographs printed on standard photographic paper, curling slightly at the edges, showing various images of the landscape around the camp, meadows, creeks, ridgelines in every season. Several of the photographs showed the camp itself, taken from varying distances, as though documenting construction progress over time. In one photograph, taken from the southeast in what appeared to be late summer based on the vegetation, the camp was visible in mid-construction, the cabin walls approximately half their final height. Standing in the frame, 40 feet from the camera, looking directly into the lens, was a man. He was not tall, approximately 5 feet 9, based on later measurement comparisons to known landmarks in the frame. He was lean and muscular in the way that hard outdoor labor makes a person. He had a full beard and close-cropped gray hair. He was wearing a canvas work coat and canvas trousers. His hands were at his sides. His expression, in the photograph, was entirely neutral. He looked like a man who had just checked something off a list. Thomas Eldridge looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he looked at Veitch. She was already on the radio. They found the man's name on the second day of the search, May 17, 2020, in a sealed document cache discovered beneath the floor of the cabin, under a plank that had been laid loose over a hand-dug storage pit. The cache contained a birth certificate, a social security card, 2 expired driver's licenses, and several other documents, all in the name of Raymond Edgar Hoult, born December 3, 1958, in Worland, Wyoming. Raymond Hoult was 61 years old. He was known to exist, that is, he appeared in public records. He had a last known address in Park County, Wyoming, from the mid-2000s. He had no significant criminal record, a single misdemeanor citation for trespassing on federal land in 2001, which had resulted in a fine he had paid in cash. He had not filed a federal income tax return since 2006. He had not appeared in any government database as an address holder, vehicle registrant, or benefits recipient since 2008. He had, to all appearances, simply become a person who existed entirely outside the systems that modern life uses to locate and account for people. He was found on the morning of May 18, 2020, not at the camp. He had not returned to the camp. He was found approximately 4.3 miles to the northwest, in a hollow between 2 limestone outcroppings at approximately 9,200 feet elevation at 8:14 in the morning. He was found by a 2-person tracking team from the DCI that included a specialist named Eric Hale, 35, who had spent 4 years tracking fugitives through wilderness terrain and who had followed a trail of physical sign, broken vegetation, ground disturbance, the marks of a man moving fast and not carefully through the night. Hoult was sitting in the hollow with his back against the limestone. He had a canvas pack, a folding knife, and approximately 6 days of food. When Eric Hale and his partner, Agent Lindsay Park, appeared on the lip of the hollow above him, he looked up. He showed no emotion that either investigator would describe as recognizable. No fear, no anger, no surprise. He sat and looked at them for approximately 7 seconds. Then he said, in a voice that Hale would describe in his report as entirely conversational, as though he were answering a question about the weather, "I wondered when you'd come." He extended his hands for the handcuffs without being asked. The search of the cabin and its surrounding area continued for 11 days after Hoult's arrest. What was inventoried in the forensic documentation, item by item, in a list that would eventually run to 847 individual entries in the evidence log, told a story of years of deliberate, patient, meticulous preparation. The food stores were sufficient for approximately 18 months. The tool inventory was complete. The medical supplies, kept in a locked box on the upper shelf of the rear section, included antibiotics, surgical thread, and a field surgery manual. There were printed materials, multiple years' worth of weather data for the region, downloaded and printed before Hoult disconnected from modern systems, livestock management guides, a homesteading manual from the 1970s, a legal digest of Wyoming search and seizure law, heavily annotated. There was also, in the front section of the cabin, on the wall above the work table, a single object that became, in the public reporting on the case, the one detail that people could not let go of, the one detail that seemed to concentrate the entire horror of the place into a single, specific thing. It was a calendar, a commercial wall calendar, the kind with large date boxes, purchased presumably in 2014. The year was printed at the top, 2014. The grid had been extended by hand, with a ruler and a ballpoint pen, beyond the printed December 31st boundary. The extension continued on a second sheet of paper taped below the calendar, and then a third, and then a fourth. Each piece of paper ruled with the same small, patient grid. The calendar covered, in total, from September 2014 to May 2020. Every day was marked. Most days had a single small check mark. Some had notations: weather, tasks completed, food inventory. A few had longer notes, written in Hoult's small, careful hand. Daniel Marsh's name appeared on the calendar on the date September 4, 2014, in a brief notation that read, "D arrived, setup complete." The trial of Raymond Edgar Hoult opened in the United States District Court for the District of Wyoming in Cheyenne on Monday, March 8, 2021. The presiding judge was the Honorable Catherine Morrow, 63, a former public defender who had served on the federal bench for 17 years and whose conduct of proceedings was described by both prosecution and defense attorneys as methodical, fair, and entirely unwilling to tolerate what she called, in a pretrial conference, the elevation of spectacle over process. Hoult was represented by a court-appointed defense attorney named Gerald Fitch, 55, a Cheyenne practitioner of considerable experience who had spent months interviewing his client and who told the prosecution team, informally, before trial, that Raymond Hoult was the most difficult client he had ever represented, not because he was uncooperative, but because he genuinely could not understand what he had done wrong. The federal charges filed against Hoult were kidnapping, as defined under 18 U.S.C. Section 1201, carrying a potential sentence of life imprisonment, unlawful restraint and deprivation of liberty, assault, and multiple counts related to the illegal occupation and modification of federal land. The state of Wyoming filed concurrent charges of aggravated kidnapping under Wyoming statute. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Connolly, 44, who had prosecuted federal land crimes and violent offenses for 12 years and who built the government's case with the same methodical precision that Thomas Eldridge had observed in Daniel Marsh's original trip plan, fact upon fact, each one placed exactly and without ornamentation. She presented the evidence in chronological order. She started with the candy wrapper. She ended with the calendar. Daniel Marsh testified on the fourth day of trial, March 11, 2021. He had spent the months since his rescue in intensive medical and psychological treatment. His weight was restored. He sat at the witness stand at 171 pounds, 11 less than his pre-disappearance weight, but functional. His hair remained white, which it had not been before. He wore a blue button-down shirt and moved with the slightly deliberate care of a man who had learned to be attentive to his own body. He testified for 3 hours and 14 minutes over 2 sessions, with a 40-minute recess between them. His account was, by every observer's description, extraordinary in its clarity and detail. The clarity of a man who had spent years with nothing to do but remember, a man for whom memory had been both torture and discipline. He described the encounter at the creek crossing, how Hoult had appeared on the opposite bank as Daniel was refilling his water bottle at approximately midday on September 5, 2014. How Hoult had been friendly, knowledgeable, had spoken about the terrain with authority and apparent goodwill. How he had offered to show Daniel a better route around a washout on the trail ahead. How Daniel, trusting the man's knowledge of the country, had followed. He described the camp as he had first seen it. The finished cabin, the stocked shelves, the air of self-sufficient order that had struck him, in the first moments, as the work of an unusual but not sinister person. How Hoult had offered food and shelter for a night. How Daniel had accepted. How he had woken the following morning to find his boots gone, his pack gone, his satellite communicator gone, and the steel cuff closed around his left ankle. He testified about the years that followed with a restraint that was audible in every sentence. Not suppression exactly, but a kind of disciplined economy, as though he had determined that the facts alone were sufficient, and that elaborating beyond the facts served no purpose he was willing to claim. He described the routine of the camp, the work he was required to do, cutting timber, carrying water, processing food stores, maintaining the cabin. The food he was given, adequate for work, never generous, the winters. He described the winters with particular brevity. He said, "The winters were very long." He described his escape. On the morning of May 8, 2020, Hoult had left the camp before dawn for one of his regular resupply runs, trips of 1 to 2 days to his cache sites or, it was later determined, to a vehicle he kept hidden under a tarp on a Forest Service road 17 miles to the northwest, which he used for infrequent, carefully timed trips to purchase supplies in small towns at significant distance from the camp. Hoult, in his routine, left Daniel chained when he departed. On this occasion, whether through oversight, whether Hoult had left the cuff insufficiently locked, whether Daniel had worked the mechanism for days or weeks in advance, and this was simply the morning his patience was redeemed, the cuff opened. Daniel described hearing the click. He described sitting for a long moment with his wrist free, looking at the open cuff, in case it was a mistake. In case it was a test, then he stood up and walked out the door. He walked for 6 days, directionally consistent toward the northeast, without knowing whether he was walking in the right direction, without adequate food, without shoes that fit. His original boots had been disposed of years before, and the replacements Hoult had provided were too small. Through country that he had come to know intimately, but had never been able to navigate toward freedom. He said, "I had thought about walking out of that country every day for years. I had planned it 100 times, and when I finally did it, I realized that my plans had been very good, and that the country was much harder than I had remembered." The courtroom was very quiet when he said this. The defense argued, as defenses must in the absence of a not guilty plea, Hoult refused to plead guilty, that there were mitigating factors in the defendant's psychological profile. The defense psychologist, Dr. Elaine Burrows, testified that Hoult demonstrated characteristics consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder, combined with delusional ideation around concepts of self-sufficiency, ownership, and what Burrows described as a constructed reality in which the social contract simply did not apply to him. She testified that in her assessment, Hoult had not conceptualized what he was doing as captivity. She presented this not as exculpation, but as explanation. The distinction being one that Judge Morrow was careful to articulate to the jury in her instructions. Hoult took the stand once, briefly, on the 7th day of trial. He answered questions in the same calm, informational tone that Eric Hale had described from the hollow in the limestone, as though the proceedings were a technical assessment in which he was a cooperating subject. When Maria Connolly asked him why he had taken Daniel Marsh, he paused for a moment in the manner of a man searching for the most accurate language. Then he said, "I needed help with the camp. The work was more than one person could maintain." He said this without apology, without defiance, and without any perceptible understanding of why the room went so quiet when he did. The jury deliberated for 2 days and 4 hours. On the afternoon of March 22, 2021, they returned a guilty verdict on all federal counts. On April 30, 2021, Judge Catherine Morrow sentenced Raymond Edgar Hoult to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on the federal kidnapping charge, with concurrent sentences on all remaining counts. At sentencing, Daniel Marsh was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. He stood at the podium for a moment, looking at his prepared notes, and then set them aside. He spoke for 3 minutes and 40 seconds without notes. He said, in part, "For 5 years and 8 months, the thing I held on to was a specific memory, a very ordinary morning, drinking coffee at my kitchen table, reading a newspaper, with my daughter sitting across from me. I made that morning last as long as I needed it to. I'm grateful I had it to hold on to. I'm grateful I can now make new ones." He then sat down and looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked up at the back of the courtroom, where Abby was sitting, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. In the months and years following the trial, the people involved in this case resumed and revised their lives in the quiet, asymmetric way that survivors and their witnesses always do. Not fully restored, not destroyed, but changed at some structural level that no amount of time entirely reconfigures. Daniel Marsh returned to Bozeman. He did not return to his position at Morrison and Hale Associates. His hands, which had done years of hard labor, had developed a tremor in the right that made precision drafting difficult, and he did not try to overcome it. He took a position as a part-time lecturer in structural engineering at Montana State University, teaching 2 courses per semester. His students, many of whom knew his story, found him exacting and patient, and, on certain days toward the end of the academic year when the spring light hit the campus at a particular angle, noticeably distracted, as though something in him was recalibrating to the open sky. He bought a new green truck. He kept the truck detailed and clean. He did not go back into the backcountry, Abby Marsh continued her work in structural engineering in Billings. She joined the board of a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving trail safety documentation and overdue hiker response protocols in the Northern Rockies. She spent 3 months helping to develop a standardized trip plan format that the Shoshone and several adjacent national forests subsequently adopted. It looks, in its layout and level of detail, remarkably similar to her father's original plan from 2014, the one that had been good enough to find a candy wrapper in 2.4 million acres, but not good enough to save the man who made it. Thomas Eldridge retired from the Shoshone National Forest in October 2022 after 39 years of service. At his retirement gathering, his colleagues presented him with a framed topographic map of the country between the Elk Fork Drainage and Eagle Peak, on which someone had hand-marked in red the route of the May 2020 recovery team. He accepted the frame and looked at the map for a moment and said, quietly, that he had thought about that country almost every day since 2014. He said that the candy wrapper, logged as SARG 0916-01, was the thing he thought about most. A small piece of foil caught under a rock at a creek crossing, the only evidence that a man's passage had left in 2.4 million acres of wilderness. He said he had learned things from this case that he hadn't known how to learn any other way. Curtis Abe, the retired game warden whose 3 solo excursions in 2018 had found the cache site that reopened the investigation, attended the trial as a member of the public on 2 separate days. He sat in the gallery and watched and did not speak to any journalists afterward. He drove back to his house outside Cody and resumed his retirement. He would later be cited in the case's official review conducted by the Forest Service as having demonstrated extraordinary backcountry investigative intuition and should be recognized as a material contributor to the resolution of this case. The citation was sent to him by mail. He filed it somewhere he described as probably a drawer. Raymond Edgar Hoult was processed into the federal prison system in June 2021. He is currently held at a federal correctional institution in Colorado. By multiple accounts from the Bureau of Prison staff, he has been a compliant and unremarkable prisoner. He tends his small assigned space with considerable tidiness. He reads extensively. He has applied for no programs and made no requests for early review. He has received no visitors. He has made no public statements since the trial. His leather journal, evidence item CAB0094 in the forensic inventory, filled with years of entries in his small, neat hand, remains in the FBI's evidence archive in Salt Lake City. It will remain there for the duration of the criminal case's legal life cycle. No one who has read it in full has described it as the journal of a monster. Everyone who has read it in full has found, in its pages, something more unsettling than monstrousness. The voice of a man who was, in every entry, entirely at peace with himself. A man who considered the camp a success, the arrangement functional, the work meaningful, the life, his life, well-constructed and satisfying. The final entry, dated May 7, 2020, the day before Daniel Marsh's escape, the day before Hoult left for his resupply run, reads, in its entirety, good weather holding, cabin sound, stores adequate for winter, everything as it should be. He was, by every available measurement, correct about all of it. He had missed only the one detail he had never considered worth measuring, the will of the man he had kept there, patient and precise, quietly working a lock in the early hours before dawn, waiting for the morning the click would come. Daniel Marsh's trip plan, the original copy, remains in the files of the Shoshone National Forest District Office in Cody, Wyoming. On its cover page, in Daniel's block lettering, is a note in the margin that no investigator remarked upon and no journalist ever quoted, but that Thomas Eldridge photographed before he retired and keeps on his desk at his home in Cody. Leave good notes. Someone may need to find you.
Daniel Marsh's story is a chilling reminder of how easily a life can be hidden away and how powerful the will to survive truly is. What are your thoughts on this investigation and Daniel's incredible resilience? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive. Stay safe out there.